Good morning and happy Sunday. Today is day 20, which means we are halfway through our 40 days of knowing Jesus. And I really hope and pray that this has been a blessing to you as much as it's been a blessing for me. I have loved digging into Luke and not just learning more about Jesus, but learning more about his character and who he is and who he still is to me today. So today we're in Luke chapter 11, verses 29 through 54. And our sweet treat is that Jesus is brave. Today's reading comes in three sections that seem quite different from each other, but as we read, I hope you'll see that the middle section really refers to the passage before it as well as the passage after it. So let's invite the Holy Spirit to enlighten us as we read his word together today. Yesterday's passage ended with Jesus speaking to a crowd of people after casting a demon out of a mute demon out of a man. Today we pick up in verse 29 while the crowds are still gathered together and Jesus continues to teach the crowds. Jesus tells the people that this is an evil generation seeking a sign. The irony here is that Jesus has given the people many great signs already. They've watched him perform miracle after miracle. But they were wanting something else. They had not shifted their way of thinking. They still believed that when the Messiah came, he would come as a political figure, a military leader that would overthrow the Roman government and liberate the Jews for good. But this is not at all how Jesus came. Then he says that no sign will be given to this generation except the sign of Jonah, the prophet. See, Jonah himself became a sign. In the Old Testament, God had asked Jonah to go and preach to the people of Nineveh. And Jonah said, "No way, I am not going to Nineveh. Those people are evil and I'm not going there." Long story short, Jonah ended up in the belly of a big fish for 3 days. And then he was miraculously spit out alive. Sound familiar? It's a little foreshadowing of what we're going to see with Jesus. But Jonah became that miracle, that moment that he was spit out of the fish. And so these people are saying, we want a sign, and Jesus is saying, you will not receive a sign except for the sign of Jonah the prophet. He said, I am going to be that sign that you are waiting for. Jonah's very life was the miraculous sign, and now Jesus' very life would be the most miraculous sign of all. To this generation of people that were fortunate enough to be in the very presence of the living, breathing Son of God. Then Jesus goes on to share this very cryptic story about a queen from the south. But don't worry, it made perfect sense to the crowd he was speaking to. He's referring to the Queen of Sheba, who back in 1 Kings chapter 10 came from the ends of the earth to see Solomon and the amazing things that God had done for him. The crowd, being well versed on their Jewish history, knew exactly what Jesus was talking about. Like the Ninevite men, the Queen of Sheba was a Gentile, but her heart was open to God, and she had a greater faith in him than this generation who literally stood in front of Jesus himself. Solomon was King David's son. Yet Jesus was often called the son of David because he was of the lineage of David. Jesus is telling the crowd that King Solomon may have been Israel's wisest and richest ruler, but Jesus is an even greater king than Solomon was. Jonah may have been Israel's most amazing miraculous sign, but Jesus was an even greater miracle than that. Now, the people must have thought that Jesus had great audacity to speak such things, but the thing is, Jesus was just speaking the truth. In the second section of today's reading, we see Jesus giving the crowd a warning about inner darkness. He says, imagine you're walking around in the dark. No one who's in the dark would hide their lamp. Our eyes need light to see. And if your eye is working well, then the lamplight will guide you when you walk. But if your eye is bad, you cannot see the light, you'll stumble and you'll fall in the darkness. So Jesus warns them to take heed that the light in them is not darkness. In other words, pay attention to what's inside of you. Is your heart full of darkness or of light? Are you spiritually blind, living in darkness, or do you have eyes to see the truth that's standing right before you? When we think back to the first section of today's reading, we remember that the people were looking for that miraculous sign, and Jesus told them that he was the sign that they had been waiting for. And then in this middle section, he's telling them that if they're spiritually blind and full of darkness, they won't even see the miracle that is right in front of them. The same holds true for today. How often does God perform miracles and wonders to our world, and those in darkness simply write it off as being a coincidence, or they explain it with science? How often do we as Christians take for granted the miracles that surround us? We must be diligent to make sure that we are filled with God's light, so that we'll have spiritual eyes to see all that he's doing. Now, we enter the third and final portion of today's passage, and we see how the same theme is woven into these verses as well. While Jesus was speaking, a Pharisee in the crowd decided to ask Jesus to come back to his house and dine, and Jesus accepted the invitation. The next verse tells us that the Pharisee marveled that Jesus did not first wash his hands before dinner. Now, you may not think too much of it, or you may assume that people in that day weren't nearly as hygienic, but there's an underlying issue here. In those days, the most pious Jews practiced a ceremonial ritual of extensive and extremely technical hand washing. To them, it was a great sin to skip over this practice. In fact, the most revered rabbis would even practice this ritual between each course of the meal. There was even occasions when rabbis were excommunicated and imprisoned for not partaking in these ceremonies. So it's a huge deal to them. And this particular Pharisee is fit to be tied when Jesus merely sits down at the table to eat. Jesus, however, is not having it when the Pharisee gets all flustered and upset. Jesus calls him out immediately, stating that the Pharisee is far too preoccupied with how things look on the outside, where he should be more concerned about how things look on the inside. It doesn't matter if you appear to be righteous if your heart is really corrupt. Jesus goes on to say, "Woe to you, Pharisees." He says this not once, but 3 times in this next passage, not out of personal disgust, but out of a warning to their souls. He says, "Woe to you, for you're great at tithing and giving, but you pass by justice and the love of God." He's calling them hypocrites for giving in the flesh, but not caring in their hearts. He's telling them that they're focused on the trivial things that do not matter, and they could be doing true good in the world. Honestly, I have to pause here and think about the current pandemic our world is facing. It's easy right now to get caught up and focus on the trivial things. We're upset we can't go to church today. We're upset that we can't find toilet paper. We're mad that we can't go to our cousin's wedding, or that our children might not get to have their high school graduation. Meanwhile, there's a lost and dying world out there, and they're scared. And when they get on social media, what do they see from us? Do they see that we're mad at our pastor for canceling church? Or do they see hope and encouragement from us? Jesus goes on to say that tithing is a good thing, but it's not good if that's where you stop. He says, "Woe to you, Pharisees, for trying to make yourselves look good, for sitting in the front pew at church. And woe to you for being hypocrites." He brings it all home when he tells them that they are like a bunch of unmarked graves who have been walked all over by people who didn't even know they were walking on them. See, in those days, if a Jewish person came in contact with a dead body, even if it was underground and they didn't know it, they were considered to be defiled. So in other words, you're defiling everyone who comes in contact you without them even knowing it. Your hypocrisy is so harmful to not just yourself, but to others. Then one of the lawyers speaks out from the crowd and says, "Whoa, whoa, whoa. When you're saying these things to the Pharisees, the same applies to us." Now, I have no idea why this lawyer just didn't keep his mouth shut, but he didn't. See, a lawyer in those days was quite different from the attorneys we have today. A lawyer was someone who was an expert at understanding the law of Moses. So they're basically ancient Bible scholars, and they were really offended that Jesus pointed out the hypocrisy of the Pharisees because they knew they were really no better. Jesus holds nothing back when he shouts out, "Woe to you lawyers, you men, you load men down with your burdens that are too heavy to bear, yet you yourself don't touch the burdens with your fingers." Jesus is simply pointing out that these men were so well versed in the law and that they would exercise the law harshly on people, requiring that they observe the very letter of the law. But if there was a loophole to be found, they would take advantage of it for themselves. Pastor David Guzik shares an example of this. He says, "On the Sabbath, it was forbidden to tie a knot. because it was considered work. Except a woman could tie a knot in her girdle. That was allowed. So if a bucket of water had to be raised from the well, you could not tie a rope to the bucket, but a woman could tie her girdle to the bucket and raise it from the well. So as you see, the letter of the law was followed, but the spirit of the law obviously wasn't. And that's what these lawyers were so good at. And Jesus is pointing that out, that they're not following the spirit of the law. They're being legalistic and following it to the letter, taking advantage of the loopholes, but yet still criticizing others and making sure they follow it to the letter. So Jesus does not stop here. He continues on to say, "Woe to you, for you build the tombs of prophets who were killed by your fathers." He's saying you like to pretend that you care about the prophets of old, but you don't even care about the prophets that are living here right in front of you. You're no better than your fathers, and they killed the prophets. In fact, Jesus takes it even one step further by prophesying that they will actually kill his disciples. Then he projects radical condemnation over this generation of people, stating that the blood of every prophet that has ever been shed is now on their shoulders. He's holding them to a higher level of accountability because he is the Lord made flesh in their presence, and they still reject him. Finally, Jesus lets out the saddest woe to you yet. Woe to you, lawyers, for you have taken away the key of knowledge. You yourselves have not entered, and you have hindered anyone else from entering behind you. He tells them that their legalistic approach to the law has made it so that not only do they not understand it, but they have confused everyone that has come to them. It's bad enough that they've damned their own souls to hell, but even worse is that they are the reason others are missing out on eternity in heaven. The lawyers and the Pharisees do not take kindly to Jesus' correction. Instead of receiving it with humility, they are outraged and they start making accusations against Jesus. More than ever before, they are determined to catch him doing something wrong. Today's sweet treat is that Jesus is brave. That's not a characteristic we often associate with Jesus, but let's think on this for a moment. Jesus was God, but Jesus was also man. It took bravery and courage to speak truth into these crowds of people. He knew they could kill him. He even knew that eventually they would. It would have been so much easier to avoid these difficult conversations like the one he had today with the Pharisees and the lawyers. But Jesus never backed down from speaking truth, and that takes courage. Jesus wasn't brave simply because he was God made flesh. In fact, it was his flesh that made him the most vulnerable. Jesus was brave because he knew he was doing the will of God the Father. In the same way, we can take courage when we are about our Father's business. There truly is no safer place to be. I hope you have a great rest of your Sunday, and I look forward to seeing you back here tomorrow. Have a great day. Bye.